good to be back at Biola. As I was mentioning to some friends earlier, it's basically a homecoming for me to be back here on campus. So thank you for having me. Before I get started in sharing something from the Word, I want to share a little bit of Word through hip hop. And one of the things I like to do is write my own raps and poetry. So it's a song, but I'm going to do it in the form of a poem. This is A Tale of Two Lions. A shadow quickly disappears over the dark concrete. A silhouette barely spotted, your heart skips a beat. The sound of feet comes closer, you break into a sweat. But now it's too late. Your eyes have just met. So will his eyes hypnotize, leaving you in a trance. Got you swinging side to side like a slow dance. From the depths of his throat, you hear a slight growl. His brow forms a frown, his nostrils wide round. The sound that resounds, echoes around, loud a roar. Powerful enough to frighten a crowd. Proud lion stands before you looking ready to devour. As you shake and cry, you feel like a coward. You fell for his disguise, now you caught in a snare. Feeling like you can't break away from his stare. He wants your head on the mantle over his fireplace. He's the one that comes to kill, steal, and annihilate. Now your fate flies away, life flashing before your eyes. Wondering if there wasn't more to life. You ran with the lion, gave you the things you were eyeing. But all along, he was scheming and lying. You give one last cry to the skies, your voice rises. But there's a voice that surprises. Keep your eye on the lion of Zion. He will try. Keep your eye on the lion of Zion. He will try. Standing solid as a bedrock, his head rocks a flowing mane like dreadlocks, a voice that can make the dead walk. This is a different lion, seeks to defend the weak, the poor, the lonely, the one that can't speak, the ones that were abandoned, the ones that were forgotten, the ones that ran away. He went out and sought them, the ones that have been broken, bruised, and abused, breathes life into them. Healing is infused, soothed are the wounds, scars are reversed. Blessed is the cursed, makes the last the first. And yes, he took blows even for those who opposed him, gave himself up when the enemy closed in. Fierce as he was, pierced for his love, didn't fight back, not even a shove. But don't get it twisted, he ain't a punk. Sprung back to life like a comeback dunk. Now we can't be contained, tamed in a cage. Wild as he walks, roars with a rage. Keep your eye on the lion of Zion. He will triumph. Thank you. Thanks. In Matthew chapter 20, starting at verse 1, I'm not going to actually read the passage. But there's a parable about a landowner, an owner of a vineyard that goes out and hires some workers to work his vineyard. And this morning I want to share with you that story, but I'm going to remix it. And I want to make it in a context as if it was in the city where I live in, which is Santa Ana, or Santana as we say. And so we find in this story a wealthy homeowner. He lives in a beautiful neighborhood in my city called Floral Park. He's got a big mansion. Kind of looks like the White House. And so this wealthy man has to do some repairs to his home. Actually, his insurance company is telling him that if he doesn't do these repairs soon enough, his policy is going to get canceled. So he's under the gun. So he rushes over to Home Depot early in the morning, 6 a.m. He goes and buys the supplies that he needs, and then he finds some day laborers that are waiting outside in the parking lot. And so at 6 a.m., he hires a group of day laborers, and he agrees that he's going to pay them each $100. They say, that's great, we'll do it. Sounds like a great price. So then they go out back to the house, and these guys start working on the roof. Some of them are painting. Some of them are doing some work, laying some floors inside the house. At about 11:30 or so, some of these guys go and take a lunch break. They're sharing some time together. They're having camaraderie together. And they're sharing a lot of their stories. They're bonding. In the meantime, the homeowner goes, and at about 12, he goes, picks up some more supplies, and he notices that there are still more workers that haven't been hired waiting in the parking lot, some day laborers. So he goes and he invites a few more, and he says, fellas, would you want to come and do some work for me? And they say, sure, yeah, of course we would. He says, I'll pay you a good rate. And they say, all right, we'll do it. So then he takes them with him, and he goes back to the home. So as these other guys are finishing up their lunch, these new workers are coming in, and they get back to work in the midst of the hot sun. Now, as the day progresses, the homeowner realizes, wow, I need a few more supplies. So he rushes back to Home Depot, and he sees that there are still more workers there. And so he hires a few more, and he repeats that at 3 o'clock and at 5 o'clock, bringing in more workers. When the day is over, he says, well, just as I promised, I'm going to pay you all the money that I said. So he says, let's get in line right here. And for those of you that I hired last, I want you to get at the beginning of the line. Those of you that I hired first, I want you to get at the end of the line. And so the guys that were hired first are standing at the end, and they notice that the people in the front, the ones that came at the very end, just did like an hour's worth of work. Not in the sun or anything like that. When it was already a little bit more cloudy and shady, they got paid $100. You're saying, what? $100? And then the next guys get paid $100, and then the next. And finally, when it gets to the ones that were there the longest, they're thinking, well, maybe he's going to pay us more than what he promised us. I mean, those guys are getting $100, and we worked more than like twice as hard as them. But they get the $100 that he promised them. And so they begin to complain and say, wait a minute, this isn't fair. We did an unequal amount of work, but yet we're getting an equal amount of pay. And the homeowner says, now, didn't we agree on the $100? And he said, well, yeah, but look, we were here from the morning and we had to brave the hot sun. He said, wait a minute, but you said that $100 was fair, right? Well, yeah, that's fair. I mean, it sounded fair to be, well, have I been unfair to you? I've kept my word. And so he paid them the $100. And as it says at the end of the passage in Matthew 21:16, so the last shall be first, and the first last. Now, the parable of the workers is a parable about not necessarily how to run a business here and now. Do we have any business majors here? If you ran a business in this way, if you paid your employees in this way, what would happen to the business? Probably would go broke, wouldn't last very long, right? This is not a story about how to run a business. It's not about commerce. But it's about the owner and the character that he demonstrates. Because at the beginning of the passage, it says, for the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning. And so the landowner is the focus, and his generosity demonstrates the character of God as it's lived out in the kingdom, as it's manifested in his kingdom. And so what this parable shows us is how in the kingdom of God, or the kingdom of heaven as Matthew refers to it, the typical hierarchies and the way people are usually ranked is completely disrupted. And God's kingdom isn't based on the hierarchies that we would typically see existing in the world. The hierarchy that exists in the world is upset by God's grace, by his generosity, by his love, by his compassion. Now, this story is not about who comes in first or who comes in second. It's about how there's a different kind of currency at work in the kingdom of God. And God loves his people in a way that's not based on merit, right? The kingdom of God is not a meritocracy, as we see here most often. And yet, there's still a question that remains, which is, what does this apply? How does this apply when we think about who are the first and who are the last? What is this story talking about? Now, even though it's talking about the owner, there is still a big question about, well, if we want to apply this more directly, how do we understand the first and the last that are being referred to here? We might say in a general way, well, the last are those that maybe are socially excluded in society. And this story is about how in the kingdom, those that have been socially excluded can also partake fully of the kingdom and of God himself. We might also notice that the story is written to a Jewish audience, as it's in Matthew, who has a very Jewish context as he's writing. And we may understand that it's talking about how Israel, who was chosen by God, and yet Gentiles that were brought in, both get to fully experience God's blessings. And though God still, I believe, has a plan for Israel, those that were not of Israel are also able to experience the fullness of God. The last shall be first, the first shall be last. The hierarchy is disrupted. But yet we understand that at all points, we may find ourselves in a position where we feel at any given time that we are the last. That maybe we're not the ones that came in first. That maybe we're not the ones that earned the highest position, whether that's in society, whether that's even looking at a church context, in a religious context, we may not have the highest position. We all may find ourselves in a position where we feel like we are not at the highest point. And yet, what does God do about that? Well, for me, growing up, and even coming to Biola, as was mentioned, I spent 8 years here at Biola, and have always come and gone. Not 8 years as an undergrad, 4 years as an undergrad. I don't want to scare, and then 4 years at Talbot. I don't want to scare some of you all. But my experience here was interesting in that as a Latino male, Mexican American to be more specific, second generation, born here in the U.S., son of immigrants. I grew up in a Spanish-speaking church. I grew up in a church where most of the services were conducted in Spanish. Some of the stuff was in English, but most of it was in Spanish. And it was a smaller church, and there was a good portion of immigrant families there. And coming to Biola, I oftentimes felt like I was a little bit on the downside of things, like I was a little bit behind the times, like I was not quite up to date, and not quite as aware of things in the Christian world. I felt like I was a little bit behind the times. When I compared my experience in church, and then I would hear some of these experiences of my friends and my buddies, it sounded like, man, I kind of got gypped. Like I didn't get to do a lot of the things that they got to do in their church experience. I didn't get to go to some of these cool camps. I got to go to camp, but I didn't get to go to these camps where they had, you get to jump on the blob, and you get to go on the zip line, and you get to, we would go to camp, and we'd be sitting in service till midnight, at the altar, praying, and that was our camp, We wouldn't have church, their youth groups would have church lock-ins, stay up all night and do all kinds of crazy things and everything. And it was for us, our youth group had vigilias. It's that means a prayer vigil. Pray until 3 a.m. The church I grew up in was very charismatic, very, you could say Pentecostal. And so even that put me in a minority position here, right? Here at Biola. And so the youth group for us was, we called it wholeness, which means youth, basically, right? Same thing. Except it's not really the same thing, because wholeness is anybody who's not married, kind of. So if you go to wholeness, you might expect the 45-year-old single guy might just show up and be a part of the wholeness group, That's how it was, very Latino culture, being very inclusive, very open. And so suddenly when I came here, I realized, whoa, I don't know, my church experience wasn't as hip, it wasn't as cool maybe, and I was still involved at my church at the time, and I was still involved in youth leadership, and, became a youth leader at 13 years old, no, well, no, teaching kids and stuff. But, it seemed like that was kind of the thing to do in the Latino church. It's kind of like you're already involved in leadership and doing all these things. And I began to feel a bit of an outsider sometimes in the Christian culture here at Biola. Though I was building great friendships, and though I was really enjoying my time here, at the same time, there was a part of me that was starting to feel like, man, I'm not fully in it. I'm not fully part of this culture here. And so a part of me began to form maybe some bitterness, or maybe some an oppositional mentality, where I kind of like wanted to separate myself a little bit and feel like, well, I'm different, so I'm going to be different. And one of the things I really clung to, and it's still a part of me, was hip-hop culture. I grew up around a lot of hip-hop, going to high school and even before that. And so to me, I felt like, wow, hip-hop to me can really represent a way to distinguish myself. And so some cool things happened through that. We started forming, we started having some hip-hop events here. Do they still do Sola Sol? Sola Sol still going on? That started when I was an undergrad here. And I still remember the person that came up with that name and everything. We formed a hip-hop group here, and we would go and get invited to churches and youth events and things like that. We got to do an event over here at Berendo Street Baptist Church in LA, right, with DJ. So I still remember that. That was back in the 90s. And with Gio. And so, but when I was on campus, there was kind of this sense of like, yeah, I'm different, and I'm going to be different. And I'm going to keep this difference. And I'm going to keep up certain barriers, and I'm going to keep up certain boundaries. And one of the things I study in sociology is how we use all kinds of different cultural tools and cultural expressions to create boundaries amongst ourselves. We do it with the things we like the tastes, the things that we like to consume. We create boundaries with that. Well, I don't do that. I don't try that. I don't eat at that place, or I don't wear this brand, or I don't listen to that. Things like, things we consume, we create boundaries with that. Sometimes we create boundaries through our forms of cultural expression. One of the most basic ones is language. The way we talk can sometimes leave people out or bring them in. Sometimes that's just a practical part of who we are. But I began to realize, some of these things I want to use as boundaries. I want to keep boundaries in my life, because you know what? If I feel like I'm less, then fine. If people want to look down on me because I didn't experience, what they had, well, fine, then I'll make something good out of it. And a pride began to come up in me because of that. Now, there was a good aspect of pride, a healthiness that eventually began to form. But for a time, it wasn't always healthy. For a time, it was more of something that brought division. And that's part of the pain that sometimes comes up when you feel like you're not heard. And so it's easy to judge that and say, oh, he just said it was divisive. Well, yeah, but sometimes that's why we need to listen to each other and hear what's going on. And so what God began to do in my life, he began to show me, hey, you may feel like the last, but I can raise you up to feel like the first. And so what God did is when I began to get involved in urban ministry and began to go on mission trips, I began to realize that some of these cultural tools that God had given me through my church and through my experience growing up, they actually came in handy when I was doing urban ministry. Or when I was doing ministry halfway across the world, like in Turkey, for example. We got to go to Turkey twice on a mission trip with Biola. And I began to realize that some of the cultural tools I had allowed me to connect even with some of the local people in ways that even some of my other friends that were on our team couldn't do. And it wasn't out of something I did. It was just something out of something that I was. It was from God's grace, what he had given me growing up. And I was able to connect with folks in different ways. And the Lord began to show me, you're not less. Your experience growing up, maybe you didn't experience such a brand name Christianity, but your experience is not less. You didn't get less of me. You didn't somehow get a lower doses of my presence or of my goodness or of my grace. You have just as much of me as some of your other friends that were part of megachurch XYZ or anybody else. And as I began to see how God would allow me to use some of these cultural tools for his glory, I began to feel a sense of wholeness. And I began to feel, in a sense, more confident and able to connect with other people. Because now it wasn't about, well, I can't fully know you because I can't cross this line. I can't cross this boundary. I can't worship in this way because then that would compromise my persona, my cultural expression. So I remember a lot of times seeing friends do certain things that I was like, man, that's just goofy, man. If I'm trying to be a hip hop artist, I can't be doing that kind of stuff. I can't be acting like that, I can't, so it's so simple. Things that you might take for granted, things as simple as like facial expressions, I can't make that facial expression. If I'm a hip hop artist, that's not hip hop, Things like, you don't see people in the hood going like that, or things like that, I can't do that, no. And yet, all kinds of people in the yearbook would be like, doing faces like that. I'm like, no, that's not cool, man. I can't do that. So, there's kind of a sense of insecurity with that. You can't cross certain. That's a boundary I don't want to cross. And yet, God allowed me to. Well, I don't do that anymore either now. But but if I did it, I'd feel fine. I just did it right now. See, so. I didn't feel like I had to protect that, and so I felt more free to express my culture as a form of worshiping God, as a way to demonstrate to people God's goodness, God's grace. And see, the thing about this parable of the last and the first is that as I said, at any given moment, we may find ourselves in a position where we feel like we're the last, whether it's because of sin that we've committed, whether it's because of social status or lack of status or lack of experiences or different things that make us feel less. We may all find ourselves at that position at some point. But simultaneously, we may also find ourselves in the position of feeling like the first, because that began to happen to me as well. When I got involved in urban ministry, I started to get a sense of pride, like, wow, God has blessed me with these cultural tools to be able to engage people in this urban setting. And I began to feel like, I'm better than those people doing suburban ministry because I'm doing urban ministry. They're doing suburban ministry. So, and I'm living in the inner city, I live in Santa Ana, and I lived in one of the communities there for a couple of years in one of the more densely populated neighborhoods. And Erica knows, Townsend Street as well, very, very well. And so, there's a sense of pride, like, well, those people can't relate to what I'm doing. And so I kind of began to elevate myself and feel like, now I'm actually the first, see? And I'm actually going to get the first rewards because I'm making the greater sacrifice. And those others, they're the last, see? So the tables are turned. But yet, see, this parable, this story is ultimately it's not about ranking. It's about how God completely disrupts the rankings. It's about how God completely does away with this hierarchy in his kingdom. And so, at any given moment, we may be the last. At any given moment, we may be the first. And yet, we all receive God's grace and goodness to the same extent. Now, what do we do with that then, finally, when we talk about cultural expression? When we talk about how some of these things, some of these expressions, they may separate us. Do we just do away with them? Do we say, no, well, okay, then, if there's no last or first, then therefore, let's do away with all cultural differences. Let's try to eradicate all of our unique expressions. And that's not what I'm here to say this morning either. Because the reality is, all these different expressions have a place in the kingdom. But the way to express them when they are at their purest and greatest form is when we use them to express God's grace, when we use them to worship God, when we use them to be compassionate, just as the story of the landowner, where he demonstrated compassion beyond what he had to. You know, the story, as the story goes, it's quite likely that the last people he hired were probably people that he didn't need to hire, and were probably people that were left over that nobody else wanted to hire. In fact, that's what they said. You know, nobody else would hire us. And so it's a story about God's compassion. And so in the same way, our culture is best expressed and is seen in its purest way when we use it to express that same love and compassion and grace to others. People say, well, maybe that doesn't have a place in the church. I say the church is the best place for it. And the church is a place where we most need to bring these expressions of God's grace and be open to experiencing them, because through them, God shows us his character. So I invite you this morning, I want to say a prayer with you all this morning. And I just feel compelled to pray. If there's anybody here this morning, I don't know whether you're a new student here, whether you've been here for a while, or maybe even a staff person, and maybe you don't quite feel like you fit, whether it's here or whether it's in the church, or maybe you feel like you're an outsider, even in the people of God. And I want to pray this morning that God would allow you to know in your heart of hearts that you are fully his and you are fully part of his people.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.